In November 1781, somewhere in the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean, 54 human beings were thrown overboard to drown. They screamed. They struggled. Some begged for mercy. The crew of the British slave ship Zong watched them disappear beneath the waves and then went about their business. 2 days later, they threw 42 more people into the sea, then 36 more. Then 10 more chose to jump rather than be thrown. In total, over 130 enslaved Africans were murdered in cold blood. This wasn't an act of panic. It wasn't a desperate decision in the face of disaster. It was a calculated business decision, meticulously planned and coldly executed. And when the case finally reached a British courtroom, no one was charged with murder. Instead, it was argued as an insurance claim, a dispute over lost cargo, nothing more. This is the story of the Zong Massacre. And what makes it even more chilling is what it reveals about how enslaved people were valued under the law, not as humans, not even as livestock, but as objects, as property, as things that could be thrown away when they became inconvenient and then claimed on an insurance policy like damaged furniture. The Zong Massacre became one of the most powerful symbols of the Atlantic slave trade's brutality, not just because of the deaths themselves, but because of the cold, calculating logic that justified them, and because when the truth came out, the legal system saw nothing wrong with it. Let's go back to where this horror began. The ship that would become infamous as the Zong didn't start out British. It was originally a Dutch vessel called the Zorg, or Zorg, which ironically means care in Dutch. In February 1781, during the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, the British captured the ship off the coast of West Africa and brought it to Cape Coast Castle in modern-day Ghana. The ship was seized as a prize of war, sold, and quickly pressed into service in the slave trade by a Liverpool-based syndicate led by William Gregson. They renamed it the Zong. The new owners wasted no time. They hired a captain named Luke Collingwood, a former ship surgeon who had never captained a vessel before. This would be both his first and last command. Collingwood assembled a crew of just 17 men, a skeleton staff for any ship, let alone one about to transport hundreds of human beings across the Atlantic. Many of them were remnants of the previous Dutch crew or unemployed sailors picked up from settlements along the African coast. The ship itself was small, just 110 tons, designed to carry maybe 200 enslaved people under the horrific standards of the day. But Collingwood and the Gregson syndicate had other plans. They were going to maximize profits. On August 18, 1781, the Zong left Accra with 440 enslaved Africans crammed into its hull. Let that number sink in for a moment. 442 people on a ship designed for half that many. In the 1780s, British slave ships typically carried 1.75 enslaved people per ton of the ship's capacity. The Zong carried 4 people per ton. The conditions below deck must have been unimaginable. The enslaved Africans were shackled together in pairs in spaces so cramped that each person had less room than someone in a coffin. The air was thick with the stench of human waste, vomit, and death. There was barely room to sit, let alone lie down. Disease spread like wildfire in these conditions, and the crew of 17 men couldn't maintain even basic sanitary conditions for so many people. After taking on water at São Tomé, the Zong began its voyage across the Atlantic on September 6, 1781. The ship was heading to Jamaica, a journey that should have taken about 60 days under normal circumstances, but nothing about this voyage would be normal. By mid-November, Captain Collingwood was gravely ill. The first mate James Kelsall, had been suspended from duty after an argument on November 14th. The command structure of the ship was falling apart. A man named Robert Stubbs, who had captained a slave ship decades earlier but wasn't officially part of the crew, took temporary command. No one was really in charge, and that's when the navigational errors began. On November 18th or 19th, the Zong approached Tobago in the Caribbean. They could have stopped to replenish their water supplies. They didn't. Instead, the ship sailed on. Then came the critical mistake. On November 28th, they sighted land at a distance of 27 nautical miles. It was Jamaica. But whoever was navigating the ship misidentified it as the French colony of Saint-Domingue on the island of Hispaniola. So the Zong kept sailing west, leaving Jamaica behind. By the time they realized their error, they were 300 miles past their destination. The voyage that should have taken 60 days was now stretching past 100. By this point, people were dying. Overcrowding, malnutrition, disease, and accidents had already killed approximately 62 enslaved Africans and 7 crew members. Sickness was spreading through the ship, and according to the crew's later testimony, the water supplies were running dangerously low. First Mate James Kelsall would later claim that when they discovered their navigational error, there was only 4 days' worth of water left on the ship, and Jamaica was still 10 to 13 sailing days away. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn, because what happened next wasn't about survival. It was about money. The Gregson syndicate had taken out an insurance policy on the enslaved Africans, as was standard business practice. The insurance covered losses due to perils of the sea, storms, and other maritime disasters. But there was a crucial detail in these policies. If enslaved people died on board the ship from natural causes like disease or malnutrition, the insurance wouldn't pay out. The owners would lose their investment. However, if cargo had to be jettisoned, thrown overboard to save the ship or the rest of the cargo, the insurance company would be liable. This was an old maritime principle called general average. If you had to sacrifice part of your cargo to save the rest in an emergency, the insurers would cover that loss. And someone on the Zong had an idea. The enslaved Africans were insured as cargo. If they died on board, the owners got nothing. But if they were thrown overboard as a necessary sacrifice to save the ship, the insurance would pay $30 per person. It was simple economics. The sick and dying enslaved people were going to die anyway. If they died on board, they were worthless. If they were thrown overboard, they were worth $30 each. And if you threw enough of them overboard, you could claim the water shortage was so severe that drastic action was necessary. On November 29th, 1781, the killing began. The crew selected 54 enslaved Africans and brought them up on deck. We don't know exactly what was said or what these people understood was about to happen to them. But we know what came next. One by one, they were thrown into the Atlantic Ocean. The crew watched them drown. According to later testimony, their screams could be heard throughout the ship. The other enslaved Africans, still shackled below deck, heard everything. 2 days later, on December 1st, the crew threw 42 more people overboard. These were male enslaved people, according to the records. Then, in the following days, another 36 people were murdered. By this point, something had changed. Rain had fallen. The water shortage, if it had ever truly existed, was no longer acute. But the killing continued anyway. Finally, in what might be the most heartbreaking detail of this entire story, 10 enslaved Africans chose to jump into the ocean themselves rather than be thrown. They chose death on their own terms, rather than at the hands of their captors. One man remarkably managed to climb back onto the ship after being thrown overboard. He survived the entire ordeal. The court records note this as if it were merely an interesting footnote. In total, approximately 130 to 142 enslaved Africans were killed, depending on which historical account you consult. When the Zong finally limped into Black River, Jamaica, on December 22, 1781, just 208 enslaved Africans remained alive, less than half of the 442 who had boarded in Africa. Captain Luke Collingwood died 3 days after reaching Jamaica. He never faced questions about what happened on his ship. The surviving 208 enslaved people were sold in the Jamaican slave market in January 1782. They sold for an average price of 30 cedis per person, which was considered a good price. These people, who had survived one of the most horrific journeys imaginable, were then sent to work on sugar plantations where the average lifespan of newly arrived enslaved people was just 3 years. But the story doesn't end there, because while those survivors disappeared into a life of forced labor, the owners of the Zong were preparing to get paid for the people they had murdered. The Gregson syndicate filed an insurance claim with their underwriters, a group led by Thomas Gilbert. They claimed $30 per head for 132 enslaved Africans, valuing them at the average price the surviving captives had fetched at auction. Their argument was straightforward. The ship had run low on water due to navigational errors and the perils of the sea. To save the crew and the remaining enslaved people, it had been necessary to throw the sick and dying overboard. It was a regrettable but justifiable sacrifice under the principle of general average. The insurers should pay up, but Thomas Gilbert and his syndicate smelled something wrong. They refused to pay. Their investigators discovered something that the Gregson syndicate hadn't mentioned. When the Zong was inventoried in Jamaica, it still had 420 gallons of water on board. There had been no water shortage, or if there had been, it was the result of gross negligence and mismanagement by the captain and crew. The ship's logbook, which would have provided crucial evidence about daily water rations and conditions on board, had mysteriously gone missing after the ship reached Jamaica. The insurers suspected it had been deliberately destroyed. The Gregson syndicate denied this, but the missing logbook meant that almost all of our evidence about what happened comes from the court proceedings that followed. In March 1783, more than a year after the massacre, the case went to trial at London's Guildhall. This was not a murder trial. Let me repeat that. This was not a murder trial. No one was being prosecuted for throwing over 130 human beings into the ocean. The only question before the court was whether the insurance company had to pay for lost cargo. The trial was officially called Gregson v. Gilbert, the owners versus the insurers. And the central legal question was this: had the crew jettisoned the cargo out of necessity to save the ship, or had they acted negligently? The only witness who testified at the first trial was Robert Stubbs, the man who had temporarily commanded the ship when Collingwood was ill. His testimony painted a picture of dire necessity. Water was running out. People were dying. The decision to throw people overboard had been made to save those who could still be saved. The jury heard his testimony. They deliberated, and then they delivered their verdict. The jury found in favor of the Gregson syndicate. The insurers were liable for the charges. Why? Because, as the reasoning went, enslaved people were the same as any other cargo. Just as it would be permissible to throw bales of cotton overboard to save a ship, it was permissible to throw enslaved people overboard. The law recognized no moral distinction. But the story might have ended there, buried in the obscure records of maritime insurance law, if not for one man. On March 19, 1783, just days after the trial, a formerly enslaved man named Olaudah Equiano learned about the case. Equiano had an extraordinary life story of his own. Born around 1745 in what is now Nigeria, he was kidnapped as a child and sold into slavery. He survived the Middle Passage, was sold multiple times, and eventually purchased his own freedom in 1706. By 1783, he was living in London, part of a community of free black people known as the Sons of Africa. He had become a writer and was beginning to emerge as one of the leading voices in the growing abolitionist movement. When Equiano heard about the Zong case, he was horrified. He immediately went to see Granville Sharp, one of England's most prominent anti-slavery activists. Sharp was a civil servant and scholar who had devoted much of his life to fighting slavery through the courts. He had been involved in several landmark cases, including the famous Somerset case in 1772, which had established that enslaved people could not be forcibly removed from England. Sharp had a reputation for taking on impossible cases and making as much noise as possible about injustice. When Equiano told Sharp about the Zong, Sharp was outraged. He saw immediately what this case represented. It wasn't just about insurance fraud or maritime law. It was about the fundamental legal status of enslaved people under British law. The crew of the Zong had committed mass murder, and everyone was treating it as a property dispute. Sharp set to work immediately. He sought legal advice about prosecuting the crew for murder. He wrote letters to anyone who would listen, including bishops, members of Parliament, the Lords Commissioners of Admiralty, and the Prime Minister, the Duke of Portland. Most of them didn't respond, but Sharp didn't give up. Meanwhile, the insurers appealed the verdict. They wanted a retrial. On May 21st and 22, 1783, the case was heard again, this time before the Court of King's Bench in Westminster Hall. This was the highest court in Great Britain, presided over by Lord Chief Justice the Earl of Mansfield, along with two other judges, Mr. Justice Buller and Mr. Justice Wills. Granville Sharp attended the hearing and had it recorded at his own expense. Most of what we know about the Zong Massacre today comes from this transcript. The Solicitor General John Lee appeared on behalf of the Zong's owners, just as he had in the first trial, and he made the legal argument explicit in language that still has the power to shock us today. He reportedly said, "What is this claim that human people have been thrown overboard? This is a case of chattels or goods. Blacks are goods and property. It is madness to accuse these well-serving, honorable men of murder. The case is the same as if wood had been thrown overboard." Let that sink in for a moment. Human people were goods. Enslaved Africans were property. To throw them overboard was no different than discarding wood. This wasn't the ranting of some fringe extremist. This was the Solicitor General of Great Britain, one of the highest legal officers in the land, articulating the legal consensus of his time. But the appeal hearing also revealed new evidence. The insurers produced testimony showing that there had been 420 gallons of water on board when the ship reached Jamaica. Rain had fallen during the period when people were being killed. The crew had made serious navigational errors. Lord Mansfield and his fellow judges reviewed this evidence, and they ruled that a retrial should be ordered on the grounds that the captain and crew had been negligent. The ship had been poorly managed. The captain should have made suitable allowances of water for each enslaved person. The decision wasn't about the morality of killing 132 people. It was about whether the killing was necessary or the result of incompetence. But here's the thing, that retrial never happened. There's no record of it ever taking place. We don't know if it was settled out of court, if the case was quietly dropped, or if it simply faded away. What we do know is that despite Granville Sharp's best efforts, no member of the crew was ever prosecuted for murder. No one went to jail. No one faced criminal charges. The men responsible for throwing 132 people into the ocean to drown simply went back to their lives. The Solicitor General refused to bring criminal charges. His reasoning, according to Sharp's notes, was that this was a case about property, not people. To prosecute the crew for murder would be to recognize enslaved Africans as human beings under the law, and the law was clear. They were property. To charge the crew with murder would be, in his words, madness. It would undermine the entire legal foundation of the slave trade. But while the killers escaped justice, something else was happening. The Zong Massacre was becoming public knowledge. Newspaper accounts of the case began to appear. The details were shocking, even to people who had previously given little thought to the realities of the slave trade. Sharp wrote extensively about the case, distributing copies of his account to anyone who would read it. He sent information to Quaker meetings, to church groups, to members of Parliament. He made the Zong Massacre a cause célèbre. The immediate effect was limited. Only one London newspaper reported on the first trial in March 1783. But gradually the story spread. Sharp sent an account to William Dillwyn, a Quaker who had asked for evidence about the cruelties of the slave trade. The London Yearly Meeting of the Society of Friends decided shortly after to begin campaigning against slavery. In July 1783, just months after the appeal hearing, 273 Quakers signed a petition to Parliament calling for action against the slave trade. It was a small beginning, but it was a beginning. Olaudah Equiano also ensured the story didn't die. In 1789, he published his autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano. The book became a bestseller, going through 9 editions during his lifetime. In it, Equiano described his own experiences of enslavement, including his journey across the Middle Passage. He wrote about the Zong case and about his efforts with Granville Sharp to bring the killers to justice. His book gave a human face to the statistics. He showed that the people in the hold of the Zong weren't just cargo. They were human beings with families, with memories, with hopes and dreams. Through the tireless work of Equiano, Sharp, and others, the Zong Massacre became a powerful symbol. It represented everything that was wrong with the slave trade: the dehumanization, the greed, the casual brutality, the way that human beings could be valued less than livestock, less than wood, less than nothing. And crucially, it showed how the law itself was complicit in this horror. The British legal system, the courts, the insurance policies, the maritime regulations, all of it was designed to facilitate and protect the slave trade. The Zong Massacre laid that bare for everyone to see. In May 1787, just 4 years after the Zong hearings, Granville Sharp joined with Thomas Clarkson, Olaudah Equiano, and others to found the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. This organization would become the driving force behind the abolition movement in Britain. Thomas Clarkson traveled the country, gathering evidence about the slave trade, interviewing sailors, collecting instruments of torture used on slave ships. He wrote pamphlets and gave lectures. Clarkson frequently referenced the Zong Massacre in his writings, holding it up as an example of the trade's inhumanity. Other abolitionists took up the cause as well. Equiano, another formerly enslaved man living in London, wrote about the Zong in his works. James Ramsay, a former ship surgeon who had witnessed the horrors of slavery firsthand, cited the case. John Newton, the former slave ship captain who had become a clergyman and written the hymn Amazing Grace, spoke about the Zong. These accounts often didn't name the specific ship or captain, which had an interesting effect. It made the Zong Massacre representative of the entire slave trade. This wasn't just about one ship. This kind of horror could be happening on any ship, and in many ways it was. The abolitionist movement grew dramatically in the late 1780s. What had been a fringe cause championed by a few dedicated activists became a mass movement. Public opinion was shifting. In 1788, Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act of 1788. Its first law regulating the slave trade, it limited the number of enslaved people that could be carried per ship based on the ship's tonnage. It wasn't abolition, but it was recognition that something needed to change. In 1791, Parliament passed another law that specifically prohibited insurance companies from reimbursing ship owners when enslaved people were murdered by being thrown overboard. This law was a direct response to the Zong case. Never again would ship owners be able to profit from such killings by filing an insurance claim. But the real goal was complete abolition. The movement pushed forward through the 1790s and into the 1800s. William Wilberforce took up the cause in Parliament, introducing bill after bill to end the slave trade. He faced fierce opposition from powerful commercial interests who profited from slavery, from plantation owners in the colonies, from the ports of Liverpool and Bristol that had grown wealthy on the triangular trade. But the abolitionists persisted. They organized petitions, held public meetings, distributed literature. They made abolition a moral crusade. Finally, in 1807, Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, which abolished British participation in the transatlantic slave trade. British ships could no longer transport enslaved Africans. British citizens could no longer profit from the trade. It was a massive victory, though it didn't free anyone who was already enslaved. That would take another 26 years. In 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act finally ended slavery throughout most of the British Empire, though it included a system of apprenticeship that kept many formerly enslaved people in bondage for years afterward. The Zong Massacre was not the only factor in this long struggle, but it played a crucial role. It gave the abolition movement a powerful, concrete example of the slave trade's brutality. It showed that the problem wasn't just cruel individuals, it was the entire system. The law itself valued enslaved people as objects. The economic structures incentivized their murder, and when that murder was exposed, no one faced consequences. The Zong Massacre made it impossible to look away from these truths. Looking back at the Zong Massacre today, from a distance of over 2 centuries, certain questions haunt us. How could ordinary men, sailors, merchants, lawyers, judges participate in such horror? How could a legal system treat mass murder as a property dispute? How could an entire society build its prosperity on such suffering? But perhaps the more important question is this: what does the Zong Massacre teach us about how legal systems can be designed to dehumanize people? About how economic incentives can make cruelty rational? About how injustice can be normalized when it's profitable? The Zong Massacre reminds us that law is not neutral. The British legal system in 1783 didn't just fail to protect enslaved Africans. It actively facilitated their exploitation and murder. Property law, contract law, insurance law, maritime law, all of these supposedly neutral technical fields were structured to enable slavery. And when the system was challenged, when Granville Sharp tried to have the crew prosecuted for murder, the system protected itself, because to acknowledge that the killings on the Zong were murder would have been to acknowledge that enslaved people were human beings. And that would have undermined the entire edifice of slavery. The story of the Zong is also a story about resistance and memory. Olaudah Equiano didn't have to bring the case to Granville Sharp's attention. He could have looked away. It wasn't his fight, in the sense that he was free, living in London, making a life for himself. But he chose to act. He chose to ensure that those 132 people who drowned in the Atlantic would not be forgotten. Granville Sharp didn't have to spend years writing letters, attending hearings, distributing pamphlets about the case, but he did. He made sure the story was told over and over until it couldn't be ignored, and eventually their persistence paid off. The Zong Massacre became a rallying cry. It moved people who had been indifferent to become abolitionists. It gave the movement momentum. It showed that change was necessary and possible. In 2007, on the bicentenary of the Slave Trade Act of 1807, Britain held commemorations of the end of the slave trade. The Zong Massacre was remembered as a central part of that history. A replica of the Zong sailed on the River Thames in London. A stone memorial was placed at the docking site in Black River, Jamaica, where the ship had arrived with its cargo of survivors. The memorial honors the memory of those who were murdered. Their names are lost to history, but their deaths changed history. The Zong Massacre has also inspired artists, writers, and scholars. The painter J.M.W. Turner may have been thinking of the Zong when he created his famous 1840 painting Slave Ship, which shows enslaved people drowning in the ocean while a ship sails away. The novelist Fred de Aguiar wrote Feeding the Ghosts in 1997, a fictionalized account of one enslaved person who survived being thrown overboard. The playwright Margaret Busby created An African Cargo in 2007, depicting the massacre and the court case. The poet M. Nurbese Philip wrote Zong in 2008, a book-length poem that deconstructs the court transcript using the legal language itself to create a memorial to the dead. These artistic works ensure that the memory of the Zong Massacre lives on. They remind us that behind the legal abstractions, the insurance claims, the property disputes, there were real people. 132 individuals with lives and stories that were cut short. We don't know their names. We don't know where they came from or who they left behind. But we know they existed. We know they suffered. We know they were murdered. And we know their deaths mattered. The Zong Massacre stands as one of the most chilling symbols of the Atlantic slave trade's brutality, not because it was unique. Many other horrors occurred on countless other ships, but because it was exposed, because the legal proceedings created a record, because Equiano and Sharp refused to let it be forgotten, and because it showed with crystal clarity how enslaved people were valued under the law, not as humans, less than livestock, as cargo to be insured and discarded when convenient. That is the legacy of the Zong Massacre. It's a story of unimaginable cruelty and suffering, but it's also a story of how that cruelty was exposed, how it moved people to action, and how it contributed to one of the great moral revolutions in human history, the abolition of slavery. The 132 people who were thrown into the Atlantic in November and December of 1781 did not die in vain. Their deaths became a catalyst for change. And that, at least, is something. It's not justice. Nothing could ever bring justice for what happened on the Zong. But it's a reminder that even the darkest chapters of history can light the way toward a better future if we're willing to face them honestly and learn from them. The Zong Massacre asks us to remember, to bear witness, and to commit ourselves to building legal and social systems that recognize the full humanity of every person. That's the least we owe to those who drowned in the cold waters of the Atlantic and to the millions more who suffered and died in the machinery of slavery. Their lives mattered. Their deaths mattered. And their story must never be forgotten. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.